Okay, so as suggested there, which you can see, we're going to look at an overview of 1 Samuel. So we finished the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, and I think if you're like me, enjoyed that time which we spent just reflecting again on the life of the Lord as recorded by Mark, and seeing some of the things which were recorded and being touched again when we came to those last chapters. And now we're going to look at something which is quite different. And the purpose this evening is to just to try and get a feel for what this book is about, and to perhaps think about how we should go about studying it, and what we should be trying to gain from looking at a book like 1 Samuel. So that's the purpose really this evening. I think more of this evening will be a little bit like just sort of giving sort of knowledge, just some things that are in the book and about the book, some application, but generally speaking, this evening is really just about trying to get ourselves into the frame of mind of understanding what 1 Samuel is about, where does it fit in terms of the Bible, what is its general message, so that we're in a position that when we look at passages in more detail, we can then sort of draw out the applications from it. So I sort of apologize at the start that maybe in one sense there won't be as much practical teaching this evening, but hopefully it will be compensated by the fact that we'll spend some time just getting a feel for the book, and a general sort of understanding of what it's about. I'm going to read a few verses that go through the passage, and the idea would with this is just to pick out some of the verses that we'll then touch on as we go through. So we'll start at 1 Samuel, and I'm just going to read a few verses throughout the book. I thought it was probably a bit much to read the entire book. I think all 31 chapters might be a bit much for an evening. Well, our meeting anyway. So 1 Samuel chapter 1, and starting at verse 1, says, "There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim on the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. This man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord." And then if you just drop over to verse 20. "And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord." So we are introduced to a family, and a priest and his sons Eli, and then we've been introduced to Samuel. So those are sort of starting points. And then if you move to chapter 3, chapter 2 firstly, if we just go to chapter 2, and if we drop in at verse 28. So the Lord is speaking to Eli, and he says in chapter 2:28, "Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel? Therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed." And then to chapter 3. "Now the young man Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision." And then to the end of chapter 3, verse 19, "And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground." So a little bit about Samuel there and Eli. And then in chapter 4, just going to read in at verse 10. Okay, chapter 4, verse 10. So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and they fled, every man to his home. And there was a great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers, and the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Okay, then just move over to chapter 8. So we just read a little bit about the ark. We read about the Philistines and how that they defeated Israel. And we've just read there that Eli's sons died. And in chapter 8, it says, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And then into chapter 9, we'll just pick up that first king that comes, as we've just mentioned there, the decision that they made to have a monarchy. It says, there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zerah, son of Bechorath, son of Aphia, a Benjamite, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upwards, he was taller than any of the people. So we are introduced to Saul at this point, and he becomes the first king as requested and by the people. And then I just want you to drop all the way over to chapter 15. I've got just a couple more verses which I want to read to you. Just 3 more passages to go to. So chapter 15, verses 22 to 26. We're just going to read. So chapter 15, verses 22 to 26. It says, and Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you, speaking to Saul, have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord from your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore please pardon my sin and return with me, that I may worship the Lord. And Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And so we find the rejection of Saul. And then if we move into chapter 16, we're introduced to a further person who becomes key in the book of Samuel. In chapter 16, verses 12 and 13. And Samuel has gone down to Jesse, and it says, and he sent and brought him in. This is his youngest son, which is David. Now he was ruddy, and he had beautiful eyes, and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So we're introduced to David, who became the second king, and the rest of the book, which is devoted to ventures of David and Saul, which we'll speak about more in a moment. We'll just turn all the way up to the last chapter. We're just going to read the last few verses from the last chapter to finish reading, and then hopefully we'll try and put some thoughts together in all of it. So chapter 31. Verses 1 to 7 say, now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and his archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me. But his armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all the men on the same day together. And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled. And the Philistines came and lived in them. And we'll look to God to bless those readings that we've just taken from the book of Samuel. So I've read quite a lot there, a lot of different places, and I'm hoping that in my thoughts this evening as we go through that you'll be able to refer back to the fact that the things which I'm saying have come from the book of Samuel, and we will find them in more detail as we look at them through the weeks. So what I would like to do is to just tackle the book in a few ways. So I'm going to start by thinking about some basic information with you, just so we can put the book in context. And then we'll look at some of the key themes that run through the book, and just have a look at it as an overall an overview. And we'll have a look, although not in too much detail, we'll look at a breakdown of the book, which is pretty much how we're going to study it over the weeks, as been sort of sectioned off by John recently. So we'll have a look at that. And then I just want to pick up a few thoughts with you, some of the key sort of parts which we'll note, which is just to look at Samuel, the author, at least of some of the book. We'll look at the events of Samuel, just to kind of get an overview on him and what he did. And also we'll just have a look at a map, so we can kind of try to put ourselves in the position of where all this happens. We're going to mention the Ark of the Covenant and talk a little bit about the Ark in a moment. And so we'll look specifically at what happens with that. I want to just draw out a couple of key verses with you that I think are helpful in trying to look at the book. And then we'll finally finish with a comparison of Saul and David, 2 of the key figures throughout the book. So it looks like we've got quite a bit to get through there. But it's just to give us an idea on how this book sort of is put together. So let's have a look at the basic information. So firstly, it's called 1 Samuel, and you'll know that there is a 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Samuel were originally written as one complete document, and it outlines the history of the finishing of the judges and the starting of the kings. And in fact, it really goes together with the four books, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And they were known as 4 books: the 1st Kingdom, 2nd Kingdoms, 3rd Kingdoms, and 4th Kingdom. So they were split up at some point into 4 separate books. 1 and 2 Samuel were originally on 1 scroll, and so the focus of our studies over the next weeks and months is going to be on 1 Samuel, which is the first of these books, and it is called 1 Samuel. It was originally called Samuel, and if you look into Chronicles chapter 29, you'll see that there's reference there to this book being from the prophet or the seer Samuel, the seer Nathan, and the seer Gad. So it's impossible for Samuel to have written both 1 and 2 Samuel, because he died before all of the events took place. So his death is accounted in chapter 25 of 1 Samuel, and so all the chapters from 26 onwards and through into 2 Samuel must have been written by someone else. The reason it comes under one name is because he starts off this book, and when it was just one big scroll, then it was just known as Samuel. But it's likely that the 2 books, 1 and 2 Samuel, were written, compiled by Samuel, Nathan, and Gad, who were all prophets and seers. They were elders, and they were renowned in the time of Samuel. It was written around about the time about 1100 BC. That's when Samuel was alive, between those 2 points in time. So the first 25 chapters, which record Samuel's life, and his dealings with Saul and David, and they would have been written up around about that time. And then chapter 26 onwards is likely to have been written about 85 years later. And the reason for that is because there's reference in the books to the divided kingdom. And so there are places, even in the first 25 chapters, where it first refers to the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. And until the split after Solomon's reign, there was no divided kingdom. So it's likely that some of those elements and writings just sort of got into the writing as it was compiled and put together over the time. But just an indication, we're talking about a book that was written 1,000 years before the Lord was born. It deals with the history of Israel following on from Judges. So Judges chapter 16, which is kind of almost halfway through Judges, just over. So it's the end of Samson's life. You get the sort of final judge of Judges, and then the remaining parts of Judges are the place where there's an awful lot of apostasy and awful acts that go on, but not really judges in that particular part. And then you've got the book of Ruth, which happened around the same time as the Judges. And then 1 Samuel is it comes after, chronologically comes after Judges chapter 16, the end of Judges 16. And it deals with the last judge, the prophet Samuel, who is the last judge, and the beginning of the monarchy. And just to say at this point here that we find that throughout this particular book, there was no superpower at the time. Egypt was a big power before. It's not really a major threat or a big power at the time. They're obviously still around. The big kingdom of Babylon didn't come on for several hundred years later, and the other big kingdoms and empires. So at the time when Samuel was alive and the writing of this book, there wasn't a great big sort of empire. There wasn't a big superpower. There were small nations and groups of people, and the Philistines actually become the main enemy to Israel at this time. They come in, they're a sort of sea people. They come in and live on the coast, and they are a constant threat. And you'll find that in 1 and 2 Samuel is the main occurrences of the Philistines. They are literally in the Bible from the end of Judges, bits of Judges there we see them, and then a massive amount is taken up in 1 and 2 Samuel with the Philistines. These become this big enemy to Saul and to David, and eventually subdued by David. And the Amalekites, who are there as well as a sort of constant threat. So there's some enemies which we're going to meet, which are constantly having battles with the people of Israel. So that's our basic information. Hopefully we position 1 Samuel within the history of the Old Testament. It's the final part of the Judges, and it starts the monarchy. And that's really what this book is about. It's a book of transition. This is what we shall see through the book is here we have the record of how the nation of Israel, who were living under the Judges and under a theocracy, so God was their king. God was the one who was their ruler, and they were supposed to be living in a way that had God as their ruler. They had their priesthood, they had their sacrifices, and that's how the kingdom was supposed to be. It was a nation, a set of nations. The tribes of Israel had all settled in the area, and they were supposed to be joined together in worship of the true God. And that had kind of fallen apart by as you read through the Judges, and it gets to the point in Samuel where Samuel becomes the last judge. The nation of Israel are no longer able to live in a way with God as their king. And so we find that we transition from a theocracy into a monarchy. And the monarchy is established in 1 Samuel. And we find that there is there's the king of Saul, who is not God. Well, it is God's choice, but it's the people's choice, and it becomes not God's choice in the end. And in a sense, that God chooses David as the rightful king for and his line. So in the first part, the first 7 chapters, we find this first transition from Eli to Samuel. This is Eli is not really a very godly man. We read some verses there in chapter 2 that were a prophecy to Eli, how that God had put him there and would have kept his house forever. But as it turns out, he was unfaithful. And so God removes what he was going to give to Eli and to his sons, and he gives it to Samuel. And so there's this first transition in the book, which moves from Eli and to Samuel. And we find here that in this transitional book, we also find that the contrasts are quite rich between those who follow God and obey God and those who don't, and how that God is rejected by those who are following after themselves, and how that God rejects them. And then we find those who are faithful to God, and God accepts them, and God blesses them, and God works with them. And so the first comparison really on contrast we get is between Eli and Samuel. We also get in those first 7 chapters a bit of a change between the life of Samuel and things that are going on in Samuel's life, and then the things that are going on in Eli's life and his sons in particular. And so we'll find that there's a little bit about Eli's sons and how godless they are. Then there's a little bit about Samuel and how godly he is. And then it goes back between the two. And we'll notice that as we go through. So as we transition from Eli to Samuel, and the way that Eli, who was judge really over the people, is removed, and Samuel is brought to the fore. And although Samuel is a godly judge and the people respect him and they appreciate that God is speaking through him, they still in themselves end up rejecting him and rejecting God's rule as he intended in this way. Within the section, those first 7 sections, there's a large part devoted to the Ark of God, the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant was constructed back in the wilderness when they were passing through, and it was intended to be a place which holy place which the priests would attend to, and that would be a sign of God being with the people of Israel. We'll find that the people completely take the ark in the wrong sense, and they mistreat the ark. And there's a few chapters which are devoted to the ark's wanderings. Basically, the ark is taken to battle, and the people feel that if they take the ark to battle, that means that they should win. And they treat God with contempt, and they treat his precious holy things with contempt. And as a result, the ark is captured, but the Philistines who capture it then find themselves in just as much a bother as the Israelites did, because there is a complete and total misunderstanding of the holiness of God in and through the dealings that they had with the ark. So in chapters 4 to 7, we find stories about Samuel and his wanderings and how he moves from place to place, and also what happens to the ark of God. And then when you get to the end of chapter 7, you then move into the second transition, which is from Samuel to Saul. So we read that the people didn't want Samuel's sons to rule over them, or to lead them, or to judge them, and they wanted a king. And so they asked for a king, and we find that the next few chapters is from chapters 8 to 15 deals with Saul and the transition that we have from the judges into the start of the monarchy. And Saul is the first king. And there's a bit of a debate then as to whether if whether it was God's intention to have kings or not. And you only need to read back into other parts of the Old Testament before that, and you'll realize that it was always God's intention to have a king. He wanted to have a monarchy. He always intended that Israel would have a king. The reason why it was so objectionable here, as we will touch on when we get to it, is because the reason why the people wanted a king was because they wanted to be like the nations. They didn't really appreciate that they wanted, or should have wanted, a king that would be a man after God's heart. That was the difference and the fundamental problem with the issue of them asking for a king. And we'll see that in some detail. But we find, of course, that Saul is chosen, but he is like Eli. He is after himself. He goes for himself, and he is a man who concerns himself with what the people think. He is not concerned with being holy and righteous before God, and as a result, he's rejected. And we read those verses where God rejected him, and rejected him for really quite a good reason, because he refused to obey the voice of the Lord. And then the main part of the book from chapter 16 onwards is the introduction to David. And David is a man after God's heart. And here he is contrasted with Saul, and we find the third transition in this book, which is from Saul to David, and how that Saul, his reputation declines, his rejection of God becomes more and more apparent, and David's rise in status and in power and in everything about David it comes to the fore, so that David is ready to become king. He's anointed king early on. He's ready to become king at the time then when Saul is finally killed in battle at the end of this first book. So the book itself runs from the birth of Samuel to the death of Saul, and covers approximately 94 years, according to those things that I found out. So that's the if you like, the overview, but the main theme really, which is how that we move in a transitional state from one thing to another, and how that we go from Eli to Samuel, from Samuel to Saul, from Saul to David. And we're going to pick up those themes and the changes in the nation of Israel, and how God deals with his people as they move from one thing to the next. So let's just have a look at a bit more of a breakdown of the actual book itself. I don't want to say too much about this, apart from maybe just to try and point out the general flow. So in the first 7 chapters, we find the story of Samuel, and we will look at what happens in Samuel's life. So we find his birth. We look at the wonderful way in which he was born as a result of Hannah's faith, his mother. And we then see this contrast. I've mentioned already the contrast between the family of Eli and Samuel, and on top of that, the ark of God comes into the story as well. And really, all what we find is these two things going on. We have Samuel, who is a godly lad, growing up into a godly man, who seeks to serve God and to obey God and to do the things which he should. And then you have Eli's life and Eli's sons, who are the opposite. And we find that God rejects Eli, God rejects his family, and replaces them with Samuel. And Samuel is certainly a man after God's heart. And then you find in those chapters from 4 to 7 what happens with the ark. The ark is captured. When the ark's captured, then Eli and his sons die in battle, or Eli dies when he hears about the ark. And then we find that the story goes on to illustrate something of the holiness of God, and how the obedience to God and treating God with the respect that he deserves is essential. And I think we're going to pick up some of those themes and thoughts as we go through that. And so we have the story of Samuel in those first 7 chapters, which is focused particularly on Samuel. When Samuel comes into the next bit, this is really the second section, which is the story of Saul and Samuel. So Saul becomes king, and we will then go through a series of incidents in the life of Saul, where Saul is chosen and anointed as king, and Saul starts off with victory, and he starts off humble, and he starts off in the right way. And yet it isn't too long before he rebels, and he then ends up going against what God commands because he fears the people. He doesn't have the faith to trust God in the situations he's in. And although there are small wins for him, and sometimes the enemy is defeated, in the end, what happens when he goes up against various enemies is that he ends up sinning because he doesn't do what God is asking him to do. And so in the end, God rejects Saul as king, and he rejects him on the basis that he won't do what he's asked. And it doesn't matter how handsome he is, or how strong he might be, or how much the people wanted him. For God's king and needs to be one that's going to trust him and obey him. And Saul is illustrated by one who doesn't do that. And I suppose in a way, God allows this to happen to illustrate that men are not the answer. That they are not going to be the ones that are going to be able to cope with the holiness that God demands. And when one does things by one's own strength, then we find that we fail, and it ultimately ends up in Saul's rejection. So that's the story of Saul and Samuel. And then the major section from chapter 16 onwards is the story of David and Saul. And here in this particular section, David comes on, he's anointed as king, and he is still a young lad. And he first of all is friendly with Saul, and Saul gets on well with him, and Saul recognizes his strength, he recognizes his spirituality, he recognizes his faith, and he sees something in David in those early chapters. But it's not long before he becomes jealous of David, when he realizes that God is with him and that God is not with himself, Saul. So he starts to attempt to kill David, and there are many attempts on David's life. And we trace through, and we will trace through how Saul hunts David, and how God looks after David, and how David moves around. David ends up living in the Philistine territory for some time. And we also find that David is in all the cases shown to be one who is a man after God's heart. So we'll look through a number of incidents that happen in David's life. Particularly, we'll focus on the times when Saul tries to kill him, and when David has opportunity to kill Saul, but he refuses. And he doesn't want to slay the Lord's anointed, even though he knows he's going to be king, even though he knows that God has rejected Saul. At the point that Saul is still alive, he is still king, and therefore David respects that, and he will not touch Saul. He leaves it for God to deal with. And so we find that occurs a couple of times through the life of David as recorded in these chapters. And it eventually finishes then with this sort of final part where the transition moves to David is going to become the next king. Saul's family has been rejected, and in the end, Saul's family is taken in battle. And so the pathway is opened up for David to be made king, which is the content of 2 Samuel. Okay, so that was a sort of hopefully just a brief look at what the book is about. Just going to touch on a few other bits with you to sort of hopefully get you sort of feeling your way through the book. So just a map, just to give you some idea about where you're at. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Hopefully you can. So these are just the events of Saul, which are those points that I've laid out, and I've just tried to label them onto a map so you can get some idea about where things are. So this is the land of Israel, and here we have the Dead Sea. We've got Jerusalem, the capital. It was in the end became the capital, and Bethlehem, those places that we know. There's the Sea of Galilee up there. Nothing to do really in Samuel, but just to find your bearings if you're not too sure about your map. So down on this side here, just so that we've got some idea, this is where the Philistines were, and they had a few major cities. So Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Gath, and Ekron. They were their 5 main cities, and they really where the Philistines sort of were, but they pushed their way into the land, and there were various fights that went on with the Philistines, even up here into Samaria or areas of Samaria. Samuel himself was born here in Ramah. He grew up here until he moved to Shiloh, which is where the Ark of God was, and he ministered with Eli in Shiloh, and he spent his time in the place with Eli, ministering with him. When he was grown up, he spent various times in these cities, and we find he used to sort of do a circuit around this area. So he traveled around this area in particular, but his main area was around Gilgal, Bethel, Ramah, and he used to do a yearly circuit. And as a judge, and that's what he was one of the final judges. So he would just move from place to place, judging the people. He would deal with the problems. He would try to get the people to trust God and to live for God. And that was basically where he was settled. So that's where the rest of the book of Samuel features around this place as well. Jerusalem was in the area of Benjamin, and Saul was supposed to take it but couldn't. David did in the end, and established it as the capital. A number of other places which we'll note as we go through. Ziklag, it comes up in the later part of 1 Samuel, and David moves down into sort of various areas of the Philistines as he kind of lives with them for various points when he's being chased by Saul. So that's the events of Samuel, and then just zooming in a little bit closer, my funny squiggles just wanted to touch on the Ark of the Covenant with you. And the Ark of the Covenant is this special structure that was made, and it should have been respected, and it should have been used in an appropriate way to bring the people to God. And yet it, in the end, was used as a sort of as a kind of mascot. It was degenerated into something which the people thought would be great to help them win a battle. Without actually trusting God, they tried to use the Ark of the Covenant to do that. It ends up getting captured when it's up here, and it ends up traveling around the Philistine land. It ends up going to all these different cities before it ends up getting taken back to Israel, because the Philistines realized that they're going to just keep getting judged. This is God's, this was instructed by God to be made, and it should have been respected in that sense. The Philistines basically had no right to have it. And the more they tried to move it from one place to the next, they realized that they were going to keep being judged by God. And so in the end, they send it back to Israel because they just don't want to have it. But it's a sad situation that the Israelites ended up losing the ark to them, and shows very much the spiritual state of the nation at that particular time. This little bit here is just what they used. I think they would take the ark with Samuel. Samuel would take it round with him as he judged the people. This was his little circuit that he used to do. So we'll learn a little bit about the ark and its movings, but in particular, we'll learn really more about how the people had really rejected God. So a couple of key verses which you might want to learn. As we go through, we'll find that most of the book of Samuel is story. It's great stories, brilliant stories that we will have heard in Sunday school, some that we will have given to as stories whilst giving Sunday school classes. But there's more to it than just a bunch of stories. This is a book that, as we talked about, transitions, but it's a book about people who obey God and people who don't obey God. It's a book about people who reject God, and a book about people that God rejects and God accepts. So in 1 Samuel chapter 2:30, key verse here: "For them that honor me I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed." That runs through the whole of the book. We see that in every way. Samuel is honored because he honors the Lord. David is honored because he honors the Lord. Eli and Saul both despise the Lord from various different ways, and they are rejected. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22, it says, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. This was what was said to Saul when he went against God, and he decided to sacrifice when he shouldn't have done, and he was told that it was better to be obedient. And we'll see again, obedience is key. God will be faithful to those who obey him. And 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 7, a verse which is perhaps often quoted, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And for all that we see through Samuel, we see that actually the Lord knows what is really inside. He knows Samuel's heart. He knows David's heart. And he understands and appreciates that they are following him. And so he accepts them for what they are to do in his service. Whereas he rejects Eli and his family because of the things that they were doing, and he rejects Saul because of the way in which he behaved. And so those are some key verses, and we'll find those themes running all the way through as we look through this book. In particular, the subject of rejection comes up, and it's the book where the word occurs the most. It is only a few times, but I just think it's probably worth noting that we can be rejected by God, and this is what happens here, that the Lord says to Samuel, look, obey the voice of the people in all they say, for they've not rejected you, but they've rejected me. So there is a rejection of God, and there is a rejection of his ways. We live in a society where rejection of everything to do with God, his ways and his thoughts is so apparent. Again, in Samuel 10, in the same story as it's going on, Samuel says to the people, today you've rejected your God. And this is because they wanted to have the king like the nations. They didn't really feel that having God as their king was the right thing for them to do. But then the rejection goes on when they finally get Saul, and Saul is rejected because he's rejected the word of the Lord, and so the Lord rejects him from being king. And again, in chapter 6, verse 7, same idea. It's because he's rejected him. So there's a theme of rejection through it, a rejection of God and a rejection by God of the people or individuals, depending on how they've behaved. And we'll pick that theme, I think, as we go through as well. So nearly there. Final little bit from me then, just to hopefully give you a flavour for the book. I just wanted to spend a few minutes comparing Saul and Samuel. It's probably easier to do that now as an overview, rather than when we'll see bits of Saul and David as we go through, and various bits of this will come up in more detail. We see the book as a transition. We see how that God moves from the theocracy to a monarchy. We see how the judges come to an end and the monarchy is established. But we also see within the early days of the monarchy that the family of Saul is ended up rejected. And the reason for that is that Saul's life, Saul's character, Saul's behavior is so very different to David, who in the end is the one that God has in mind for him, for his king, as his king of and his family. And of course, in the end, the Lord's in the lineage of the Lord as well. So just to outline perhaps the difference between the two people, which we will see. The more we look at Saul, the more we'll realize that he was never going to be the choice that would in the end last. He was the people's choice. He looked the part, but in his heart wasn't right. Whereas with David, he was God's choice. He was the shepherd boy. He was the one that was overlooked. They had to go and find him for him to be anointed. It was everyone's thought that one of Jesse's other sons would have been the choice, but in the end, it's the youngest shepherd boy who is taken, and because there's something inside him. And this is how God works. He isn't going to choose you to work to serve for for you to serve him based on how you look. It's about the heart that you have towards him. Saul was fearful and David was courageous. We'll find that all the way through. Saul often found himself in a fearful situation. He reacted as a result of his fear. He became paranoid. He despised David, and he had no power in the end, because he just did not trust God, and obviously God left him. Whereas David was a very different kind of man. He was a trusting. He trusted God. He obeyed God, and he had an attitude. And I think this is an interesting thing. This attitude towards God's anointed. Saul wanted to kill David, and he knew that David had been anointed, and he knew that David would be king. But his desire was to kill David, whereas David was the opposite. He appreciated something special about God's anointed, that Saul had been anointed king, and whilst he might have been rejected, he was still the king of the land at the time. And so David chooses to spare him because he didn't think it was his responsibility to take Saul's life. That was something that God would do in his time. And so we find all the contrast there between Saul and David. Saul was foolish, the way he responded to things, whereas David was wise. Probably in particular, we find the way that Saul behaves towards the sin which he does. Neither of these two men are perfect. They both failed. They both failed God. There were both times in their lives where they didn't do what they were supposed to. And yet Saul is rejected and David isn't. And it comes back to the way that they respond when they know that they've done wrong. Saul regretted the things which he did, but he was never repentant. He never really had changed his heart. And there's a difference, isn't there, between regretting something and repenting. David repented when he failed with Bathsheba. He wrote that psalm, didn't he? He was distraught when he realized what he had done, and when it came to his realization, and he repented of his sin. And that's important, that whilst we'll all fail, if we just regret having done things wrong, then that's very different, isn't it, to repenting and to really appreciating that what we've done was wrong. We find then that Saul is unable to finish the things that he started. He doesn't have the discernment, the spiritual discernment. He doesn't have the power of the Lord behind him. He couldn't actually get the Philistines under control. He often lost battles to them. Whereas with David, it was a different situation. And at the end of David's reign, the Philistines had been dealt with. And in fact, as Solomon came to the throne, there was peace throughout the land and throughout the regions around. And so Solomon was able to reign with the peace. And David was the man of blood. He was the man who fought, and he brought all of the enemies, and in particular the Philistines, he brought them under control. So David stands out in every way different to Saul. And it really is just a list of one who follows themselves, who is selfish, who follows after man's heart, and then one who follows after God's heart. And so this is the book of Samuel, which we're about to embark upon. And I just want to ask 3 questions as we start to think about this book. I think one of the questions we need to think about as we go through is, what is God going to teach me about himself in this book? It's a great book of stories. And if that's all we get out of it, then we've missed the point. There's more to just the list of stories about men who failed and men who served well and men who did the things they were supposed to. This is a book that's going to teach us about God. It's going to teach us about his dealings with people. It's going to teach us about his holiness. It's going to teach us about his faithfulness. about what is important to him. And I think as we go through, we should always have that question in mind. What is this teaching me about my God? What is this teaching me that I will know more about him, and how he responds to my behaviors? How does he want me to behave? And that comes to my second question, which is not just learning about God, but actually learning about myself. What are these verses and these stories and these people, what are they teaching me about obedience and faithfulness? How is it I can perhaps learn from those who failed to make sure I don't fail in the same way? How can I learn from those who didn't fail? What did they do and how did they behave? And those are the things that we should be asking ourselves as we go through this particular book, that we can, as Christians, learn to be more obedient and more faithful to our God. So as we learn about him, we learn more about ourselves, and and that turns into those things that are within and without. So what is God teaching me about my heart, about my affections, about my desires, and particularly my desires towards him and my feelings towards him? Because it might well be that my faith is not as strong as I think it is, that when it comes to it, if I'm put in similar situations that some of the people in this book are put into, would my heart fail me? And would I find myself doing the same things in effect that the people that failed in the book do? And would my actions then therefore display the kind of things that would display that my heart is not right? And so I think we should be challenging ourselves about how we are living, about how we appreciate our God, and how we are going to day by day develop our appreciation of our God, and to be like the characters in our book who are obedient, who are faithful, and uh, who were accepted by God and were blessed by God. And even though there were things that went wrong, even though there were things that were challenging and difficult, that even though at times, as it says, and we did read on the verses where the word of God was rare, um, there it was a day of small things, really, in the time of Samuel, and yet he was still able to be faithful. So I trust that's given you some thoughts about the book, that you've been able to at least place it in a context, understand that this is a book that's going to transition us from Judges through to Kings. It concentrates on Samuel, Saul, and David. We look at, and Eli as well, I suppose. We look at two men who were rejected by God because of they weren't faithful. And we're going to look at two people who were accepted by God in Samuel and David, who were faithful and were obedient. So I'll leave my thoughts there. I trust that's been helpful, and I hope, like me, you're looking forward to being able to look at some of the details of this book as we go through the coming weeks and months. Thank you.